Hello, in 401 BC, an army of Greek mercenaries found themselves stranded more than 1,000 miles from home, deep in hostile territory and with their generals dead. This band of soldiers has become known as the 10,000, and their 2-year journey to safety is one of the most celebrated tales of ancient history. Among the 10,000 was an Athenian called Xenophon, who later wrote a book about his experiences. His lively account of this disastrous military campaign, the Anabasis, was soon acknowledged as a masterpiece. Today, Xenophon is remembered for an output which included not only a personal memoir, but history, politics, and even practical subject. And his book on horsemanship is still in print 2,500 years after it was written. With me to discuss the life and work of Xenophon are Paul Cartledge, A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at Cambridge University, Edith Hall, Professor of Classics and English at Royal Holloway, University of London, and Simon Goldhill, Professor of Greek at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of King's College. Paul Cartledge, Xenophon was born about 430 BC. Could you give us a sketch of what the situation was in Greece at that time?
Right. He's born at the beginning of what we typically call the Peloponnesian War. That's to say, seen from the Athenian side, it was a war against Sparta and the Peloponnesians. Xenophon was an Athenian. He was an upper-class man. He was brought up with horses, and this comes out later on in his career. He is a very conservative fellow, but one thing hit him like a sort of ton of bricks in his teens, and he wasn't the only one. He met Socrates, and one of his claims to fame is that he was a kind of pupil of Socrates.
And can you fill us a bit more? We use the word aristocrat. What did that mean? I have in the notes. I've read that in the notes that all of you have written in the bits and bobs that I've read elsewhere. What did that mean in Athens at the time? Because we think Athens democracy.
Yeah, absolutely right. Athens was a democracy. 430, by the way, is the year in which Pericles gave famous funeral speech, which is preserved in our main source, which is Thucydides. But aristocrat had two meanings, really. One was terrifically rich and a landowner from way back. And Xenophon doesn't seem to be the other kind of aristocrat, which was somebody you could trace your descent back to, let's say, the founder of Athens, to Codros. For example, Plato could do that. So he was upper class, I think, would probably be a bit more accurate.
Did his wealth give him an independence that he exploited or used or rode on the back of for the rest of his life?
Well, it enabled him not to have to work. I mean, the whole key thing about being rich in ancient Greece was that you didn't actually have to work for a living. Secondly, his father could afford to let him go and study with Socrates rather than make him work on the farm. Most Greek boys were from a peasant background. This is true of Athens as every other of the 1,000 Greek cities at the time. And Xenophon was extremely privileged in that sense.
So what do we know about his education with Socrates?
Well, the answer is very little other than what he chooses to tell us himself, and that's not very much.
He wrote about it?
He wrote a bit about it, and there is a later tradition of stories about him. As we'll talk about later, he's a terribly famous guy in ancient Greece. But what being a pupil of Socrates meant was sort of following him around, because Socrates was the proverbial urban philosopher. He hardly ever left the city of Athens. He did go and fight a couple of times, a long way away, but he liked the city. He wasn't much keen on the country, whereas Xenophon's actually the other way around. He is a country lover, so that his estates would be outside Athens.
What did you most absorb from Socrates? Because he seems to present a rather different Socrates from the man we get in Plato.
Well, this is the big... it's not an issue really for us historians. It's an issue for historians of philosophy. And this comes out in the work which he devoted to Socrates, to defending Socrates from the two charges on which he was in fact convicted. First of all, being religiously unorthodox, if I can put it that way, not worshipping the gods the city of Athens recognised in the right way. And secondly, misleading, somehow corrupting, somehow being bad influence on important young people. And the memorabilia, we call it in Latin, the memoirs of Socrates, they're not Socrates' memoirs, they're memoirs about Socrates, is a series of conversations involving Socrates in which he's made to come across as very orthodox and ordinary and boring. And this is why Plato's Socrates is so much more interesting.
If I were to ask, well, I'm going to ask, did Xenophon pick up a defining notion of the way he was going to live his life from?
I would say so. I mean, in terms of virtue and Plato's notion of virtue was very different from Xenophon's notion of virtue. We don't know what Socrates was. For Xenophon, Socrates embodied perfect goodness, that he was somebody who did the right thing in the right way to the right people in the right situation, and really terrifically traditional. You could almost take Xenophon back to the time of, if there was a time of Homer. There's not a great deal of development. You wouldn't get a sense that there'd been a horrendous intellectual revolution in the middle of the 5th century, which Xenophon doesn't give any sense of.
Edith Hall, can we talk a bit more about the politics of this man being, let's keep calling him an aristocrat just for the sake of a wealthy man anyway, in a democracy which was defining itself and very proud of being a democracy, although a slave-holding democracy, and it didn't apply to women. Put that aside if we can, a democracy.
Yeah, he's more complicated politically than he seems, and almost all his works are about a tension between his view that you had excellent people who should be generals and commanders and run cities and ideal monarchs. He definitely believed in extremely able people running the show and ordering less able people around. However, because he's brought up in Athens, where there is a very great deal of talking and a very great deal of dialogue, he has a curiously egalitarian side, which makes him absolutely adamant that generals have to be nice to their soldiers, they have to feed their soldiers, they actually have to fight in the front ranks with their soldiers. It's a sort of comradely approach, which I don't think he would necessarily have got at Sparta. He's got a very matesy, humorous, loquacious, sociable streak. Can I just add one thing to what Paul said, though? I know we're not going to do the history of philosophy, but I think there is quite a simple way of looking at it. Socrates did 3 branches of philosophy, which are how do we know things, epistemology, who are we, what is existence, which is ontology, and how should we live, which is ethics and politics. And the only one Xenophon had any interest in at all was the last. So that is how he's different from the Platonic Socrates.
Yeah,
he cannot do big questions about knowledge and existence. He's only interested in how should we live.
There is this relationship, mainly antagonistic and aggressive, between Athens and Sparta, and Xenophon seems to transfer his allegiance intellectually as well as materially throughout his adult life.
It's quite a fascinating synthesis, and there is no other author in whom we get this sort of rather international or interstate Greek aristocratic sensibility. Here we get someone who is not tied to a particular city, who is able to talk about and compare not only different Greek cities like Athens and Sparta, and see the good even in Athens at times, but also with foreign cultures in Asia. He's a real cosmopolitan. You know, he talks to satraps in the Persian Empire and chieftains in the Balkans as much as he can talk to Greek people. So that's one of the reasons why talking to him, as opposed to talking to Thucydides, who's very, very centred on Athens, is so interesting.
Can we just talk about what he found in Sparta that he didn't find in Athens? Can you give us the contrast there? It's the enemy, aren't they? Very much so. There had been a great war, and he'd been caught up in it, but he was beguiled by them.
It was. They had an old-fashioned, conservative, traditional view of manly virtue, and the 4 cardinal Greek virtues of Socrates, which are manliness, self-control, intelligent reasoning, and moral rectitude. Those are the 4 cardinal virtues of Socrates, and he thought that the Spartan system of bringing up young men, which was not to be merchants, not to have any money, not to do any of the sort of marketplace democratic things that went on in Athens, but to train at hunting and fishing and hoplite warfare and all the rest of it. He admired deeply the education of the hoplite class in Sparta.
Can we just go back to his view of democracy? Because we have to, as Paul said at the beginning, Pericles has made his great speech about the time that Xenophon was born, and we look back on Athens as the first, and so on, democracy. He was very distrustful of it.
He was deeply distrustful. He thought democracy out of control, always went out of control, and always turned into ochlocracy or disorderly rabble, rule of the rabble. He is very, very clear with this when he talks later. He expresses this through his discussions of ideal armies, that the absolute most essential thing of all is order and absolute discipline in an army. Top down, all the time. And that is actually how you will get the greatest happiness, the greatest number. You know, the junior officers and the common infantry on the ground will do far better if they're obedient to a wise man.
And he transferred that across into society. So is it worth his military experience, his military ideas and experience, because he was a frontline soldier, as you said, led from the front, as it were, informed everything about his political life as well?
Well, I would actually say that his two great works, the Anabasis and the Education of Cyrus, that we'll talk about later, which are both of them ostensibly about armies and about military affairs, are actually both answers to Plato's Republic. They're marching republics, both of them in their own way. They're about how you have an ideal civic, political organism. It's a description of a political ideal, but it takes place within an army.
Simon Goldhill, let's go back to this intriguing notion of what Socrates was standing for, given that we've got the Plato Socrates and we've got the Xenophon Socrates and the ideas of the time, and we look back on it as very much an ideas-driven society. Now, are we right in that? And if so, where is Xenophon and what's going on between, let's call it a triangle, Socrates, Plato and Xenophon?
Yeah. The first thing to say is that it's absolutely true that in 5th century Athens we call it the Enlightenment of Athens, because it was an extraordinary ferment of ideas, and in particular loads of meta-ideas. That is, they didn't just do medicine, they did the theory of medicine. They didn't just do politics, they did the theory of politics. And in that, Xenophon holds a particularly interesting place. Paul described him, and Edith described him, as conservative, and there are many ways in which it's correct to call him conservative. But one shouldn't forget he's the person who writes an extraordinary range of material. He writes the first erotic novel, in some senses, in the Education of Cyrus. He writes works on hunting, he writes works of adventure, he writes works of political theory. He is intellectually not a conservative. He's an absolute radical in the way that he writes, and there's no other figure like him in the 5th century for that range of material. Now, it's true that I don't think anybody thinks he's as smart as Plato. Right? Plato is Mr. Philosophy. We're all doing footnotes to Plato still, and Xenophon's version of philosophy, even as an ethicist, is not as profound as Plato. But when Edith says quite correctly that the Education of Cyrus and the Anabasis could be seen as an answer to the Republic, you can see them as two responses to Socrates. We think of Socrates as a very liberal man who asks all sorts of probing questions. But if you think his two most profound pupils that we know about, Plato and Xenophon, are both producing works of totalitarian theory, top-down political ideas, that should make us think a little harder about Socrates.
Yeah. It's intriguing, isn't it, this idea of men who studied with, studied or learned from someone thought to be one of the greatest philosophers there has been, and in Xenophon's case, Plato, let's take Xenophon, were warriors in the first line of war, fought in battle, and did all that combination is very beguiling and has vanished.
It's vanished from modern philosophy. But I think
there aren't many philosophers leading troops in wars that we read about today, are there?
No.
No, what's another side?
But I think it is very important also to look at Xenophon's career as a really quite extraordinary thing. I mean, he goes off to fight as a mercenary, but before he goes to fight, he goes to ask the Delphic oracle whether he should fight.
Oh, he doesn't ask that.
He asks to which
I sacrifice.
He goes there.
He's doing it backwards.
He goes there. He says, "To which god should I sacrifice before I go?" And so the Delphic oracle, of course, answers the question is given. They say, "Well, you should go and sacrifice that god." Right? So then he comes back and he says to Socrates, and Socrates says, "Well, you idiot! You asked the wrong question." But because you've got the answer, you must follow it through. So we have someone who actually asks Socrates before he goes off to fight as a mercenary against Persia, the great enemy of Greece at one level.
And still the great power.
Is still the great power. Yeah. He's then going to come back and move away from Athens to live in Olympia, or live near Olympia on a estate associated with Sparta. He's writing all this different material. It's a bit like imagining in the Cold War an American who writes all these sort of different things and goes and fights in the Far East and then lives in Moscow. I mean, this is, of course he's conservative, but in one level he's really quite a shockingly interesting cultural icon of how you can cross boundaries.
Why didn't he seek a career in politics?
Why did he?
Why did he not seek out a career in politics?
I don't think he was suited for the democracy where he was living, in the sense that it was extremely hard for someone of his class, education and views to get into a democratic position of power. the people who did it had to really work quite hard to conceal not to conceal their background, but to work very carefully with the people. And I think his particular intellectual mindset of top-down discipline was very unsuitable for the democracy in which he lived.
So there's a Coriolanus element there.
Yeah.
I don't think it was just that. I mean, I think it was partly just the generation. The fact was that if he's born around 430, there are two violent overthrowings of the democracy when in his 20s, which then got corrected, and anybody associated with anti-democratic views was given an incredibly hard time. I actually think even if he had talked the democratic talk, people would have been extremely suspicious of him.
It's a bit worse than that, because he actually was fighting for the oligarchs. No, not yet for the Spartans. Later he does fight for the Spartans. He commits all the heinous crimes, actually. If you're an Athenian Democrat, his personal political career is an absolute disaster.
Exactly.
He's a cavalryman because he's very rich. And they fought for one of those revolutions you mentioned. A very small group imposed on Athens by Sparta, so they're a junta imposed from the outside, and Xenophon fights for them against a democratic resistance. So that's the background.
That's
He's feeling extremely uncomfortable being in Athens.
But he's described as a mercenary, Paul.
Oh yeah, well then the opportunity comes, and he claims, misled. He didn't know why he was joining up. A mate of his...
What was he joining up for?
He thought he was joining up to fight for a Spartan commander who was the lieutenant of a Persian prince who was going to take on a troublesome group of people called the Pisidians in what's now northwest Turkey. And actually he was joining up to support a rebel, that is the younger brother of the great king of Persia, who wanted to overthrow his older brother.
And he joined that campaign.
He joined up, and they were terrifically successful. They have to march, as you pointed out, a very long way, about 1,500 miles, to get from the Mediterranean down into southern Iraq. They win, and then this is where the trouble begins, from your introduction.
Well, troublesome introduction. Edith Hall, can you tell us why that battle is important? Canaxa, is it?
Yeah.
Canaxa,
and what happened?
Well, it's two Persian brothers battling it out for who rules the world, basically, and Xenophon's on the wrong side. He backs the younger brother, who gets killed. It ends up in single combat, he says, and the older brother not only kills his younger brother in single combat, but sticks his head on a pole and disgraces it and shames it, and then turns around and says, "How dare you Greeks over here? What the hell do you think we were doing, supporting my younger brother's mutiny?" Right, exactly. So they are stranded in the heart of Iraq, in the middle of Persian territory, having thoroughly offended the top guy. I mean, it's the classic escape story. And there are not only 10,000 soldiers, but there were probably about double that, because they had all got servants and womenfolk. They got all these camp followers, and he keeps talking about this. And they often marched in a square grid with all the donkeys, women and servants and slaves and captives and booty. I mean, it really was a marching republic. This incredible body of 20,000 people marches up the Tigris, encounters 19 days of harassment by the Persians before it gets free of the Persians. Then it marched up the Tigris through basically Armenia, I suppose.
Yes.
To
Kurdistan first, then Armenia.
To the southeastern corner of the Black Sea.
Yeah.
Where they famously yell, "We see the sea," because now as Greeks they've got to hope they could hold some boats, they could get out of there.
But it takes... Was it 1 year or 2 years? I'm confused. Some of you said 1, some have said 2. Either way, it's a long time.
The total length of that campaign, about a year. About a year. So by the summer of 400, they're back on the...
We have 20,000...
Black
Now,
Sea.
he, in his book, Simon Goldhill, says that he led them. How much do we believe of that?
Well,
and he also says, that he was elected to lead them because he's, after all, the Greeks, and they were it was a democracy, and they democratically chose their military leaders, and he was the one who was chosen.
There were generals, and he was clearly not one of those generals when the expedition started. The generals were invited to a meeting after the battle by the Persians, whereupon they were promptly slaughtered. Thus you've got 10,000 soldiers without apparent leadership. This is the perfect setup for a story of how do we think about leadership and how do we think about it. So that's the first point, that narratively it works brilliantly for Xenophon's interests. The second point is he does describe it as he was appointed because of his virtue, because of his ability to speak, because he always got to do the perfect speech at the perfect time. But of course, since he's writing the story, we have to be a little bit suspicious of
Is there any way of corroborating or undermining that?
Yes,
No.
well, there are little bits of there. No, you think that?
I think there's no external check
no
on the
external
details of his role within the 10,000.
But somebody else, one of the other generals, had written.
There are other stories going around,
He mentioned.
and so we do think that there must be some polemic involved.
Absolutely.
And you can see little gaps in the story. Occasionally, people have tried to, where they think perhaps he was maybe one of the people who helped lead. But it's a first-person narrative in which he is the hero.
Whichever way you look at it, and he encounters adventures along the way, they meet strange people, it's anthropological, it's a travel book. What was novel about it, Paul Cartledge? And also, I think Edith said it very graphically, and this is a massive amount of money, 20,000 people and donkeys, moving right through these deserts and across rivers.
Well, what's novel is the area. In other words, the Odyssey is set typically in the western part of the Greek world, and this is set in the eastern part. And it is a prose Odyssey, and Xenophon, as Simon rightly said, is terrifically innovative in that he covers many different genres and indeed invents one of them, namely biography. But I was thinking rather like Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who was in the library at Alexandria a century later. He was called Beta because he was absolutely brilliant across the whole range, in other words, both arts and sciences, but he was never the number one in any one of those disciplines. He was Beta, very unfair. Anyway, what was interesting...
distinct from Alpha.
What was interesting...
Well, there might be one or two who don't know the Greek alphabet now.
Yeah, at least he wasn't Gamma. But perhaps Beta Plus, anyway. But two Greeks reading it, and of course there are very few Greeks who could read papyrus text. Remember, this is a pretty elite sort of genre of communication. Anyway, he would be particularly interesting for precisely what you said, the anthropological thing. What is it to be Greek? And that comes out all the way. Gosh, he's a guy who doesn't eat bread. You know, that's just beyond the pale. So there's lots of that. And I would stress again religion, which I think we've not yet said enough about. Xenophon is a terrifically pious person. So he's very interested in religious customs.
Simon, do you want to
I think it's interesting to compare back to Herodotus, the great history of the Persian Wars, who, as it were, founds our sense of the Orient, of the East, as this mysterious and difficult place. Xenophon gives us a very different image, and a very important and instructive image of how he actually engages with these people. He actually talks to them. They have to buy food. They have to go through. So it's a very particular. It's the first example of, as it were, participant observation in the East,
in an event,
and in an event, and so in that sense, it really founds a whole series of imperial narratives. Very important.
Edith, do you believe he did what he said he did?
I think he did a version of it. Yes, I do, because really the climax of the narrative is after they've got to the Black Sea, to the coast, sort of moved along the Turkish coast. Basically, he wants to be a Black Sea despot. He wants to found a city and rule it. And he's been trying to prove all the time that he's up to ruling it. He wants to be philosopher king, and the boys won't play.
And on the way, he's gathered a lot of booty. So add to his wealth, he's got more loot.
Phenomenal amount of booty. But he's got an awful lot of social capital as well out of his men. I mean, this is a man who hunted ostriches on the banks of the Euphrates and tells us all about it. I mean, he saw fish that were gods in the Tigris.
That's it.
You know, he's a man who's... So whether he actually did that or not, what he has absolutely got is the imagination to think of an up-to-date hero who, like Odysseus, had seen miracles and wonders.
Seen many cities.
He sets his eyes on... He loves women. There are just all these wonderful women in Xenophon. And I think it really, time is right to bring him back into fashion, because he writes with great appreciation about beautiful and brave women. And they're all in Asia. There's Mania, who's in the histories, who's an extraordinary queen who really should be running her own country.
She's the Boudica of ancient Greece.
Panthea, who is so beautiful that all the men in the army simply, can't fight when she's around. Who ends up throwing herself on her husband's grave. He's very, very gentlemanly. He talks about how when Cyrus actually dies on the battlefield, killed by his brother, he has not one but two mistresses, one of whom was taken by the Persians, and the other whom, half naked, ran to the Greeks for help. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that I think your ordinary Greek soldier would very much like to have heard.
Can we dwell on the Blacks and his ambition to be... So they get to the sea, and I'd love for you to pronounce it in the proper Greek way. The famous words when they saw the sea, they say...
Thalassa.
Oh, there we are, you see?
En masse.
That's it. But this business of being a Black Sea despot and being stopped by his troops from doing that, that's fascinating. How did he set about trying it? How did they stop
Well, again, we've only got his word.
Well, we've got to give up that. We've said that. You
there is a tradition. There is a tradition of being a founder of a colony, and in the 4th century, there are a number of new colonies founded, and there is a thought that Plato, one of the aims of his school, was to, as it were, train up people who would go out and found cities or take over cities that already existed and make them, as Edith said, sort of philosophical cities. But actually Xenophon doesn't specify what sort of a city it would be once he'd founded it. He simply says, I'm thinking of, I thought of settling and establishing a community, but whether he would put himself forward as tyrant of it, I mean, it's not impossible, but he doesn't say that.
We should go back to Plato on this. I mean, Plato did want... he has a republic. He says, this is how you should found a state. We know that other intellectuals were practically involved in laying out the street plans for cities in South Italy. So he gets to the point where he says, I might do it. But then his men said, we want to go home.
Yeah.
We just want to go home. We've had enough of this adventuring. But it's probably best to read it not just as a little moment of history, but also as a key to think about what this text is doing for us. He's saying, think about foundations, think about the politics here. This isn't just an adventure
actually,
story.
I think what you've introduced is a notion of the ordinary, which is quite refreshing. Instead of they're not voting democratically, shall we support him or not? They're saying, I want to get back home.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
It's a different level of argument, isn't it? Really?
Quite. No, there's no question of what sort of a policy
But he had
to be.
He wasn't clear what sort of reception he was going to get back in Greece. He didn't have any vested interest in going back. That's the point.
So what did he, as it were, get out of it? How was this campaign received? When he went back, was he the glorious hero? What happened?
No, not at all. He managed to sequester some money in the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and they took a very many. They had an awful lot of booty and raiding parties, and got a lot of people to sell as slaves. So they divvied up the spoils, the generals, at the end of it, and once they'd paid the men off as far as they could. And with his money, he went and basically threw himself at the feet of the Spartans and said, I can't go back to Athens because of my political past and because I was associated with Socrates who's been put to death, etc. And they allow him to buy, apparently he says buy, an estate near Olympia in the north of the Peloponnese, which they basically ran the Peloponnese, where he settled down to write for 40 years. But I can't help feeling that he felt what had been made for greater things. That's what I think he's doing in these books. And the other great text, The Education of Cyrus, which is about an earlier Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, is one incredibly long defence of monarchy.
I know you're anxious to get onto that, but I'm anxious to take one more step on this after this campaign, Paul. So there's been this campaign, and is he actually exiled from Athens, or does he choose to go from Athens?
No, there's absolutely a question. The issue is, for what was he exiled?
Right.
Just to add to Edith, after he gets back to the Black Sea, he goes first of all to what's today Istanbul, Byzantium, and that is controlled by Sparta. And quite extraordinary, he discovers the Spartans have changed their mind about Persia. Persia had supported them through the Peloponnesian War and enabled them to beat Athens. It's Persian money.
Persia subsidised their fleet.
Exactly. And then what's happened now, for various reasons, Sparta is the leader of the Greeks. It's taken over Athens' position. Athens' position as leader of the Greeks was against the Persians. So there's a sort of logic, a sort of compulsion. They must take on the Persians. So Xenophon arrives, to his astonishment. His Spartan mates and employers, actually, are fighting the Persians now. And so he, first of all, joins up, actually, with a troop that fights for a local, as Edith said, Balkan king, in fact, in what's now Bulgaria. Then he's at a loose end, and he joins up with the Spartan force that has come over to fight the western parts of the Persian Empire. This is when he meets Agesilaus, who becomes his mentor. And he actually serves under Agesilaus for 2 years, the Spartan king Agesilaus, in Asia. Sparta arouses extreme annoyance amongst its former allies, and there is a rebellion against them back in Greece. Agesilaus is summoned back home. Xenophon goes with him, and this is when he fights for Sparta against Athens. So he is therefore a traitor. But was the initial sin, namely signing up for a Persian prince, what really caused his exile, or was it fighting for Sparta against Athens that caused it? One of the two. After 394, I'll put in a date here, he was exiled, and he lived the next 23 years on this estate that Edith mentions in, it's actually called Skylus, near Olympia.
Writing and Edith,
Yeah.
one of the books he wrote. That's our moment. Cyropedia.
The Education of Cyrus, the upbringing of Cyrus, which is a stonking 8 books.
Well, you've played Cyrus. It's 150. He's 150 years before
Yes.
Xenophon. Is Cyrus the Great?
Yes.
The Great Persian Empire. Boom. Right, that's him.
And I don't think there's a fact in The Education of Cyrus. It purports to be some sort of biography part 1, my life so far, of the young man, how he got to manhood. In fact, what it is a series of moralising episodes and speeches on how to rule, and that is exactly what it is. And this is why it was such a big Renaissance hit, because it's the Machiavelli loved it and Francis Bacon loved it, because it's how to run, how to govern your city.
As I understood it, it's got a lot of a good leader should do this and that. Can you give us one or two instances of the way saying a good leader should behave?
Okay, we have a very long dialogue. At one point, we deal with the Persian Empire is expanding under the young Cyrus. He's going around. There's a rebel king in Armenia, and the rebel king in Armenia decides he doesn't want to pay revenue to the Persians anymore. And there's a battle, and he's taken. And then Cyrus interviews him about whether or not, in a sort of set-up Socratic debate, what would you do in my place? Don't you think you'd have to execute me? Yeah? Don't you think that the only thing you can do with rebels who have pledged allegiance and broken their word is kill them? And he leads the man into admitting that that is what he would have to do, that he would have to execute. And so we have this terrible, tragic moment where we all think, and his wives and daughters are all weeping. But in fact, we then have a discussion how this is precisely the moment that you can get the best gratitude and affection out of someone. That is precisely the moment to make them a vassal when they're most vulnerable, and you can give them the biggest gift. And so he actually lets him off. So that is a practical lesson in how to extort loyalty.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's the point.
Yeah.
How do you make him loyal
Extort.
after you've treated him?
Loyalty. So this is
It has a very simple overall message as well about when you get power, about how you shouldn't give in to luxury, how you shouldn't give in to the misuse of power. And so it founds the genre of the education of princes, which goes on for so long. And then but it also has this very strong moralistic streak about what you should do in general terms of your own pleasures. He really believed very strongly that self-control in the ruler was absolutely central. And he bashes that point out again and again in this.
What does he mean by self-control? What self-control is he talking about? Which part of himself?
He's
Sex
talking
and
about
food.
sex,
His
food,
lower
drink,
body.
and money. But it's like you shouldn't look for the luxuries of lying down on the soft carpets. You shouldn't look to abuse your power over women. You shouldn't eat or drink. And of course, what he's setting this out, it's very important that this is the king of Persia, because if there's any image of Persia in the Greek mind, it's precisely luxury, abusing women, abusing men. So he's saying no. You Greeks, and remember it's written in Greek, can learn from the Persian king. Again, we shouldn't underestimate the radical nature of what he's offering.
Except
there.
it was a
But it's
long
Sparta.
time ago.
It's a long time
And
ago.
that's Edith's point.
Hold on.
Nonetheless.
Excuse me, one at a time.
Nonetheless.
One at a time, right.
Well, A, he wasn't praising the current Persian
No,
king.
that's for sure.
And B, as Edith said, there's a very strong Spartanizing streak. So in other words, some of the social customs, the court, looked much more Spartan than they do genuinely Persian.
He was also a substantial historian. He took up, as it were, literally, as it seems, He took up the
With a
work
gap.
of Thucydides.
Yeah.
Where his great history stopped, as it were, in mid-sentence,
It did.
and Xenophon starts to almost to complete
Yes,
that
he
sentence.
says after this, though actually there is a gap in reality. But
Yeah.
anyway, but going back to what we were saying earlier about Herodotus being his mentor as opposed to any other writer in prose, well, he specifically rejected a Thucydidean style of history. And there are a couple of episodes.
But he continued the history.
He
as it were,
continued it chronologically, and he
Chronologically, yeah.
continued it down to what is recognised by historians universally as a turning point. There's a major battle, and he ends the work by saying there was greater disturbance, greater confusion in Greece than even before. So in other words, he ends on a down note. But the way in which he did history, what he took to be important, is directly anti-Thucydidean in the way that some of his philosophy is anti-Platonic. He says, now, of course, most historians would go on about great expenditure, loss of life, huge victory, but what I think is important is, and then he takes as an example a leader who happens to be the half-brother of Agesilaus, and says, look how wonderfully he behaved, look how loyal his troops were. That is what history is about. And of course it isn't. Most Greeks didn't think that's what history was about. So his historiography is actually rather downbeat. And it is moralising rather than event analysing.
But just to talk, is it reliable? Do people read that and say...
Very difficult to tell. No is the answer where we can check him, because we actually have one or two
No,
other
in what
sources.
sense? Badly wrong, exaggerated?
He gives totally different factual description of a major battle, for example. In 395 BC, we have another alternative account, and most historians think that the alternative account, which goes back to a contemporary of Xenophon's, who doesn't survive as such, but is the source, is a more plausible reconstruction. All battle descriptions are more or less false, because nobody actually knows what really happened in any battle. But it seems that the way the battle evolved was better described, more logically described in this other source.
So it seems to me that what you're saying is what one of you, I think it might have been Edith, said earlier in the programme, that in this exile on near Olympia, writing these books, he was actually carving out for himself the place that he hadn't arrived up through his actions.
Yeah.
It's an interesting point,
That's how I see it.
That's how you see it.
Yeah.
And so this is history as it would have been and should have been if I'd been in charge.
Yeah.
And it's also
Yes,
the strong moralising streak that comes through this history,
And
of
back
course,
to
leads
Socrates,
directly into the Renaissance, and directly, and that's why he was so popular in the later periods, because there were a lot of people who wanted to write moralising history of a similar sort, and he provided a model for that.
But also a very beautiful sort. He has a very great, very, very powerful way of talking about how the good life, in the correct moral sense, should be lived. And it involves a very great deal of hunting with dogs, riding horses in beautiful countryside, appreciating nature, and actually being nice to your wife. I mean, you know, that there is a very, very strong prescription for how to live well. And I think that this has made him very, very popular. There's an extraordinary amount of food. Discussion of what is a good meal but proportionate to your needs and healthy. All these history works and the Education of Cyrus, there is a meal every 3 paragraphs. With how to eat, what to eat, when to eat, how not to get fat. He talks about people who get fat and how unself-controlled that is. So it is heavily moralising, but I think actually this is exactly what a lot of people in antiquity wanted. They wanted guides to how to live.
That hasn't changed much.
No. And some of his, this didactic and moral streak, he could let rip with when he actually wrote didactic works.
One of the reasons perhaps for his survival and for so long still today, and massively important in the rest of, and again in Victorian England with the public schools, the Greek, he was supposed to have the purest Greek, so they did that Greek through him and learnt that Greek history. But the number of works he did, Simon, can you briefly give us, Edith mentioned it, can you take on? We've got horsemanship, we've got hunting.
Horsemanship, hunting, we've got a manual on how to relate to your wife, educate your wife, we've got the history works.
What does he mean by educate your wife?
Well, it's how to be a housekeeper and what sort of education she should have into that, and remembering that most Greek men would be marrying between 30 and 40 a woman who's likely to be 16. You can see why the educational model comes in a rather strong way. It's a very difficult text to read, actually, in terms of how ironic it is and how it's a Socratic dialogue in some form.
Yeah.
And, of course, an ironic version of how you're meant to educate your wife is an especially difficult thing to read particularly from a historical point of view.
So you got horsemanship, hunting, and how to educate your wife.
He also did a symposium.
He did a symposium, which is a version of the same idea as Plato's symposium,
But
which
much more
ends
fun.
up much
Yes,
more fun. It
yes,
ends
yes.
up with a Syracusan dance master putting on a show that was so erotic that everybody wanted to go home and have sex with their wives immediately.
with their wives.
And the ones who weren't married to get
Married,
Now,
yeah,
given that they were in the
Believe
Piraeus,
that, you'll believe anything.
they were in the Piraeus, this party at Callias'
Yes,
house, and there were more
yes.
prostitutes available than anywhere else in Greece.
But notice at the end Socrates walks off with a boy, a young man, so it's all right.
But that is actually a great source for ancient entertainment. It has all these circus acts and performers come in, which we wouldn't know about otherwise
and
at
mythic
all.
representation.
And it's quite
Dionysus
interesting.
and
There's a
Ariadne.
good way to compare Plato and Xenophon. I mean, Plato's Symposium being one of the great texts of Neoplatonic philosophy, turning into this ideal nature of beauty, where in Xenophon we get the dancers and the drinking. And I wonder which is more accurate.
Can you give us some notion, Paul, can all three of you, as we come to the end of this of his influence, where it spread most?
Well, I think you really mentioned all the main things. In antiquity...
Well, we can't stop, you've got 2 minutes to go.
Well, right. In antiquity, he was copied regularly, which is absolutely crucial. If you're not copied, you die in terms of...
You mean literally copied?
Yeah, literally. So people found the range of his work, as well as the intrinsic interests of different ones. But one we've not mentioned is a political treatise, which is called the Hiero, and it's based on a nasty Sicilian tyrant who's asking a Greek praise singer who actually did sing his praises, Simonides, how should I live? And it's what Simon was talking about not being excessive, not being self-indulgent. And so
Elizabeth I translated that one.
I
There's a
was
copy
just
in
going-
Cambridge Library.
Thank you very much. I mean, I was going to say that's the sort of work that came through, but then hit the buffers, really, in the 19th century with the rise of criticism, German in origin, of antiquity. And so Xenophon was shunted, in
I
terms
disagree.
of...
I think Xenophon was absolutely central to the 19th century in England because of the Anabasis, where we started.
No, well, quite,
because it was
quite.
read again and again by the imperial schoolboy
But-
who was being encouraged to go out to
guess
the
what?
east.
But
and go-
you would say
American-
that was a denaturing of him. You presented a very sophisticated Xenophon, and the 19th century in England took a very
In
unsophisticated
the 21st century, American military academies are again making
Reading Xenophon.
people read it before they
On
went out
horse-
to Iraq. No,
No, on the Nemesis.
Well, I'm going to have to leave you to talk among yourselves, which I'll listen in on. Thank you very much, Edith.